Okay, so for those of you that were here last week, you might recall that I said that our gospel for that week was immediately before the feeding of the 5,000. Here we are, a week later, we have the feeding of the 5,000. It is the next thing that happens. So that puts me in a bit of a pickle for preaching today, because you might recall a few weeks ago, we talked about miracles. A miracle is a one-time event that leads us closer to God, whether it's plain or flashy, whether it is in line with the natural order or somehow contradicts the laws of physics apparently. Any way you cut it, a miracle brings us closer to God. That's what it does, that's its job. And the feeding of the 5,000 is, of course, a miracle, a rather famous one at that. So assuming that I'm not just going to repeat that lesson again, what more is there to learn from our gospel reading today? I mean, I suppose we could talk about the importance of sharing. You know, you got to share with what you got. You know, that not much is true. Honestly, though, I think we can do a little better than that today. So I'd like us to take a few moments to reflect on what Jesus was trying to achieve in the first place. Like, why did he go through the trouble of all of this to feed the 5,000? And I'm going to start off by knocking out two not-so-great answers. The first not-so-great answer is that Jesus really was just trying to feed everybody, like, physically. And to be sure, that's part of what's going on in the story today, but that can't be the whole thing. First of all, there are way easier ways to feed people than what Jesus did. And secondly, if Jesus really did just want to fill their bellies, then why were there all these baskets of fragments left over? You know, there just has to be more to the story than that. The second not-so-great answer is that Jesus had something to prove. Not really the case. You might recall at the end of the gospel reading, the people were going to try to carry him off to make him king. And then he ran away to the mountain that he was praying at earlier. Now, apparently, in the original Greek, you know, that the story was written in, carry him off to make him king had an almost violent connotation to it. I mean, these people were going to grab him and force their will upon him. They were going to make him into someone that he was never meant to be. You know, an ordinary ruler of the world, a king like any other king. That is just not Jesus' disciple. So when you take all that in, you have to come to the conclusion that we really do just have to believe that Jesus was working toward a goal, and a goal that had the best interests of everyone in mind, and a goal that could not be easily achieved any other way. And that goal pretty much boils down to this. Jesus wanted to get those people to understand and believe that they're deeply cared for by God, and with a love that goes far beyond the mere supply of food and water. Because the real gift we get from God isn't food or water, it's grace. It's that divine promise that we are more than our outer selves. You know, our basic needs, our appearances, all of that is just the very beginning of who we are and what God has in store for us. So you could say that the feeding of the 5,000 was preparing the way for the Eucharist. You know, that is to say, a holy action that involves food and drink, but with a far, far greater purpose. Because when we receive Holy Communion, we're not doing it for the calories, and we're not doing it for the flavor. It's communion with the very love of God itself. And it contains the promise of eternal life. You know, how swiftly we can forget about that sometimes, huh? And all of this is in line with what I was saying a little bit earlier, that Jesus could not possibly have been interested in mere physical needs or popularity. There must have been more to his ministry than that. That's what the Eucharist is all about, really. There had to be more to it. And we can talk about that with respect to Jesus in the Bible and Jesus in the Eucharist in the exact same way. Because there is more than mere appearances. You know, the memory that triggers for me is back when I was considering priesthood, long before I called the seminary. Plenty of people would come up to me and ask me why on earth I was considering such a thing. You know, it didn't make any sense to them given how much you have to sacrifice to become a priest in the first place. And every once in a while, I made the mistake of talking about priesthood without faith. You know, I was trying to present priesthood in this reasonable, rational way that non-Catholics could understand. And that conversation ended the same way every time. Well, Justin, if you care about that, then just become a teacher or something and get married like the rest of us. Or, and this is true, someone looked me in the eye and said this to me, well, Justin, if that's what you want to do with your life and you want to be of service to your fellow person, just become a social worker. It's way easier and they pay you more. I'm not actually convinced it's easier work, but her point was well received. And every time I caught myself in that little trap, I had no choice but to back up and say, hang on, that's not all. There is an element of faith you also have to consider. Because obviously priesthood is not glorified social work. There is a need of faith that can only be satisfied by the Eucharist. And when a man feels a pull toward that Eucharistic grace, priesthood is the result, because there is no substitution for that. And frankly, that is Jesus in a nutshell, all right? Because out there are thousands of ways for us to meet our needs for food, work, pleasure, or companionship. In those ways, the church is not unique or superior in any way. But the reception of that divine promise directly given to us by God, well, frankly, that is ours and ours alone. It is nothing less than the sacrament of the altar. And that is that goal that Jesus was working toward that entire time, from his nativity right up to his death, resurrection, and ascension into heaven. Blessed were those 5,000 that were fed by Jesus. Just so today, blessed are those called to the supper of the Lamb.